All right, Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rachah, Kodash. Double honors to the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. I'm going to continue the Daniel 11 breakdown series. And we're going to pick up from verse 13. All right, last time we went into verse 12. All right, going into Ptolemy the fourth, Philopator or Philopator, who had won, all right, in the fourth Syrian war against Antiochus the third, the Great, and in winning that, he basically, when you go into the history of the of Third Maccabees, it goes into what or how we were affected by Ptolemy's rule now over Syria. All right, because remember, in the Syrian wars, all right, which let me see, they don't really have a good imagery here, but I'll pull one up. All right, in the Syrian wars, the reason it's called the Syrian wars is because it's being fought mainly around that area for that land. All right, let's see, Syrian wars, not that. Let's see, Syrian wars, who said Greek. All right, but it's basically being fought over all Syria. All right, there we go. I'll use this. All right, so it's being fought over this land or this area right here. So after that, we read in verse 12. All right, when Ptolemy had won, he basically got that territory. But as we're going to continue to read, it says that after he won, all right, he wasn't going to be strengthened by it, because what Ptolemy did was after winning, of course, Antiochus retreated, but he just stopped right there. He didn't pursue Antiochus any further. All right. So now continuing at verse 13, it says here, "For the king of the north shall return." All right. And this king of the north that returned was Antiochus the third. All right. After losing the fourth Syrian war, he retreated. All right. Built up his army, made some alliances, did what he had to do. Okay. And as we're going to read in the secular history, when he saw the perfect opportunity, he returned. All right. Now, when Antiochus returns, to come to war with the king of the south, from verse 13 on down, this king of the south is not the same Ptolemy Philopator. All right. At this point, when they leading into the fifth Syrian war, it's not between Antiochus and Ptolemy Philopator. Is actually Ptolemy's son, all right, which was Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes. All right. So it says here, "For the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former," because he went and he got more. Like I said, he made certain alliances, all right, and he increased his army. It says, "And shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches." All right. So now I'm going to read here the fifth Syrian war. It says 202 to 195 BC. Okay, now it says the death of Ptolemy IV in 204 was followed by a bloody conflict over the regency, as his heir, Ptolemy V, was just a child. The conflict began with the murder of the dead king's wife and sister, Arsinoe, by the ministers Agathocles and Sosibius. The fate of Sosibius is unclear, but Agathocles seems to have held the regency for some time until he was lynched by the volatile Alexandrian mob. The regency was passed from one advisor to another, and the kingdom was in a state of anarchy. Now, also one thing that affected them as well was, as we're going to read here, the end after the fourth Syrian war, because in Egypt you have Edomites, and then you had native Egyptians, right? Matazarium, Mizraim. Okay. You had Jake in there as well. Okay. But you had Edomites being that ruling class. Okay. So in order to mount a big enough army to fight against Antiochus in the Fourth Syrian War, Ptolemy's general, all right, or one of his ministers, like it says here, recruited and trained an army that was not just the Edomites, not just Greeks, but also native Egyptians. Cool. They go, they win the war, but after the war, all right, it says here, and this is before the Fifth Syrian War. So it says Ptolemy's victory preserved his control over Coal Syria, and the weak king declined to advance further into Antiochus's empire, even to retake Seleucia Pieria. And says the Ptolemaic kingdom would continue to weaken over the following years. Remember, we read that what? He shall not be strengthened by it. All right, in verse 12. Okay, so it says, over the following years, suffering from economic problems and rebellion. Nationalist sentiment had developed among the native Egyptians who had fought at Raphia. So those that fought in the battle, that spirit of nationalism came up in them, like, yo, you know what I mean? Like, why these Edomites over us? Right? So it says, confident and well trained, they broke from Ptolemy in what is known as the Egyptian revolt, establishing their own kingdom in Upper Egypt, with the Ptolemies finally which the Ptolemies finally reconquered around 185 BC. So after this war, okay, Ptolemy IV dies, and upon his death, there's this chaos, drama, right? His son is just a child, you know. His wife was also murdered, So the ministers, the it's basically court intrigue going on, all right. And on top of that, you have a whole Egyptian revolt. The native Egyptians that are under you are all, ready to revolt, which they did. So things weren't looking too good. All right. So it says, going back here, it says the fate of Sosibius is unclear, but Agathocles seems to have held the regency for some time until he was lynched by the volatile Alexandrian mob. The regency was passed from one advisor to another, and the kingdom was in a state of near anarchy. Seeking to take advantage of this turmoil, Antiochus III staged a second invasion of Coal Syria. And that's why it says that in verse 13 that for the king of the north shall return. Remember, this was he waited, all right, it says after certain years, right? And he saw the perfect opportunity, so he pulled up. All right. It says he convinced Philip V of Macedon to join the war and conquer the Ptolemies' territories in Asia Minor, actions which led to the Second Macedonian War between Macedon and the Romans. So, as we were reading in Daniel 11, all right, and 13, the king of the north shall return. That was Antiochus III, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former. He increased his armies, but he also made that alliance with Philip V, right? It says, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. Verse 14, it says, and in those days, or in those times, all right, in those times, meaning the times when all this is happening, there shall many stand up against the king of the south. All right. So the king of the south at this time is Ptolemy V, the young boy. You have court intrigue. You have native Egyptians that are wilding out, revolting. You have Antiochus III, all right, he's taking advantage of that. He's coming. And then you have Philip V, all right, who's also coming up against Ptolemy or Egypt. Okay. Now, when you go into it, the deal that Antiochus made with Philip, let's see what's here. All right, let's read here. It says, and this is on Antiochus III, the Great, as they call him. All right, it says here, from Seleucia on the Tigris, he led a short expedition down the Persian Gulf against the Gerhians, it says, or the Arabian coast. Antiochus seemed to have restored the Seleucid Empire in the east, which earned him the title of the Great, Antiochus Megas. It says in 205/204 BC, the infant Ptolemy V Epiphanes succeeded to the Egyptian throne, and Antiochus is said, notably by Polybius, to have concluded a secret pact with Philip V of Macedon for the partition of Ptolemaic possessions. Because Ptolemy, yes, he had Egypt, but he also had, I believe, Cyprus, and Seleucia Pieria is really south around here, and he also had certain lands or control in Asia Minor and in the Aegean. So Philip V of Macedon, in Macedon, right, makes a pact with Antiochus, and Antiochus is coming down to basically violate Egypt, and Philip is supposed to basically, he's going to get some of the territories in the Aegean and in Asia Minor. So that was the pact. If you help me, you get to have, his lands over there because it's right there. And I'll, basically take whatever. All right. So it says, under the terms of this pact, Macedon was to receive the Ptolemaic possessions around the Aegean Sea and Cyrene, while Antiochus would annex Cyprus and Egypt. See, so they basically like I showed you, they split it up. So Egypt and Cyprus, and then Philip would have the territories in the Aegean. All right, and Cyrene. All right. So it says, but see, it didn't necessarily work out that well for them. Now, as we're gonna find out. So it says da 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 da. Once more, Antiochus attacked the Ptolemaic province of Coal Syria and Phoenicia, and by 199 BC, he seems to have led or to have had possession of it before the Aetolian leader Scopus recovered it for Ptolemy. But that recovery proved brief, for in 198 BC, Antiochus defeated Scopus at the Battle of Panium near the sources of the Jordan, a battle which marks the end of Ptolemaic rule in Judea. Okay, now the thing here is, as we were reading here, that because Philip ended up helping Antiochus, he ended up in the Second Macedonian War with Rome. All right, because it's going to say here, because see, at this time, Rome is expanding, Rome is growing. They start off over there in Italy, right, and then they basically start expanding, and then boom, they face off with Carthage. All right, you have the Punic Wars. Now Rome wins that, and that puts them drastically on the map. They've expanded greatly. Plus, now their naval force is a force to be reckoned with. All right, and then they continue to expand and expand and expand. All right, so Rome is growing at this point. It says here, and this is on Philip V. So it says, following an agreement with the Seleucid king Antiochus III to capture Egyptian-held territory from the boy king Ptolemy V, Philip was able to gain control of Egyptian territory in the Aegean Sea and in Anatolia, which is Asia Minor. It says this expansion of Macedonian influence created alarm in a number of neighboring states, including Pergamum and Rhodes. Their navies clashed with Philip's off Chios and Lade near Miletus in 201 BC. At around the same time, the Romans were finally the victors over Carthage. All right. Now, when you read into it, it says, well, I'll read this section here. In 200 BC, Philip V intended to invade Egypt, and his troops assaulted Abydos. In response, Roman troops were moved to Apollonia, all right, which is in Illyria. Okay, it says the state of war was reached because the Roman Senate regarded Philip as a dangerous lunatic, and once that Roman Senate gave that permission, that's it. It says despite a decade of war, Philip V was determined to establish control over Greece, and then it goes on, so on and so forth. But this is what led to that Second Macedonian War. Philip agreeing to help Alexander really put him in a not so good position. All right, shalom to those watching. Shalom Zaquan. All right, and all the other brothers, those watching. So it says here, going back to the Fifth Syrian War. All right, continuing, it says, seeking to take advantage of this turmoil, Antiochus III staged a second invasion of Coel, Syria. He convinced Philip V of Macedon to join the war and conquer Ptolemy's territories in Asia Minor. All right, so remember, it said that in these times, many were going to stand up against the king of the south. All right, it says, actions which led to the Second Macedonian War between Macedon and the Romans. Antiochus quickly swept through the region. After a brief setback at Gaza, he delivered a crushing blow to the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium near the head of the River Jordan, which earned him the important port of Sidon. All right, which later on in the breakdown, Sidon is going to come back. All right, as it's referred to as the fenced city. Okay, so verse 13 was Antiochus coming back. All right, to go to war with Ptolemy V. All right, known as the Fifth Syrian War. Okay, now he, as we read, he partnered up with Philip V. All right, as we read in verse 14, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. All right, now it says here, also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Okay, now the robbers of thy people, who Daniel, all right, is receiving this vision. So thy people would be who? The Israelites. Okay, who were Daniel's people? The Israelites. All right, and the robbers of Daniel's people were going into the wicked Israelites. All right, not only those who were wicked or sellouts, but you actually had, which I'm going to get a couple accounts of it in the book of Maccabees, individuals that actually robbed the temple. In terms of they took the treasure of the temple, as a means to give in order to better their position, as it says, to exalt themselves. So you have people like Simon and Menelaus, all right, and so on and so forth, all right, which were wicked individuals. Okay, now we're going to read here in the book of Jeremiah, just a quick precept. Let's start off at verse 5, Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 5. All right. Matter of fact, verse 4, it says, trust ye not in lying words, saying, the temple of the Lord Yahweh, the temple of the Lord are these. For if ye thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if ye thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if ye oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, neither walk after other gods to your hurt, then will I cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever. Behold, ye trust in lying words. Now, pay attention to the how these people are being described, all right, or characterized, right, which are wicked Israelites. So it says, ye trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will ye steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and burn incense unto Baal, and walk after other gods whom ye know not, and come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered to do all these abominations? And is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. So are you going to do all these things and come here as if it's okay? Why? Is this place a den of robbers? So all these they're referred to as robbers, okay? But if you look at the characteristics that is used to describe them, all right, robbers not only in the sense of actually stealing, all right, but in the wicked acts that they were doing, they were referred to as robbers, okay? So when you go into Daniel 11 and 14, going into the robbers of thy people, is going into wicked Israelites, all right, sellouts, those who, as we're going to read here, all right, said here, First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 11. It says, in those days there went out of Israel wicked men, all right, who persuaded many. So wicked men, all right, also robbers, would not stealing and murder and adultery and swearing falsely and burning incense unto Baal and walking after other gods be considered wicked? Yes, it would. Okay. So these wicked men, all right, it says in those days went there out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. All right. So in those days, or in these times, you were going to have wicked Israelites, all right, that were going to sell out, that were going to or leave the way of Israel, okay, for the way of the heathen. But you were also going to have those like Simon and Menelaus, all right, who are going to exalt themselves, because Simon, being a Benjamite, all right, really wanted that position. It says he had a falling away with Onias, all right, but a lot of these individuals, as we're even going to go into, let me see which individual. Yeah, Simon, all right, basically had Onias set up, and put to death, okay, because they wanted to be exalted and have that position, you know. But it says here to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Now remember, all this thing that is happening unto Israel is a part of the vision that Daniel was given. All right, when we go here to the book of Daniel, all right, chapter 10, verse 14, it says, Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. Okay, so Daniel had, numerous visions. Of course, he had different visions of different time periods, but a part of those visions that he had as to what was going to befall his people in the latter days was going into what we're reading about. So in order for that to happen, in order for that vision to accomplish or to be established, you had to have robbers or wicked individuals who would sell out. All right. It was a part of establishing the vision of what was going to befall the nation of Israel at that time. Not only sellouts, but also what Antiochus Epiphanes, all right, was going to do amongst other kings, okay, and amongst other visions that Daniel got, okay. It says here, but they shall fall. So now we're going to read an example, all right, in the book of Maccabees, of this individual Simon here, all right, going into what exactly he did, all right. So let's read it. All right. This is the book of Second Maccabees, chapter 4, verse 1. It says, This Simon now, of whom we speak afore, all right, because when you go into the third chapter, all right, it tells you here, it says, Now when the holy city was inhabited with all peace, and the laws were kept very well, because of the godliness of Onias the high priest, and his hatred of wickedness, it came to pass that even the kings themselves did honor the place, all right, and magnify the temple with their best gifts, all right. It says, insomuch that Seleucus of Asia, of his own revenues, bear all the costs belonging to the service of the sacrifices, which he's going to come up later on as well. Verse 4 says, But one Simon of the tribe of Benjamin, who was made governor of the temple, fell out with the high priest about disorder in the city. And when he could not overcome Onias, he got him to Apollonius, the son of Thracias, who then was governor of Coel or Sello, which is in the Apocrypha you see certain words are written differently. Sello Syria, Coel Syria, Kal Syria, same thing. All right, which means all Syria. It says, and Phoenicia, or Phoenice, as is written here. It says, verse 6, and told him that the treasury in Jerusalem was full of infinite sums of money, so that the multitude of their riches, which did not pertain to the account of the sacrifices, was innumerable, and that it was possible to bring all into the king's hand. So because he had a falling away or a falling out with Onias the high priest, and he was salty, and he couldn't overcome Onias, he went and said all this. And when you read in this chapter, this is what led to the king sending Heliodorus, all right, to come over there to come and get the money from the treasury, because Simon's wicked ass went and basically said, "Oh yeah, we got abundance and abundance, and then this could all be the king's," which wasn't true, as Onias explained to them. All right, but we're gonna focus more in the fourth chapter, okay, as it says here, Second Maccabees chapter 4, verse 1. It says, This Simon now, of whom we spake afore, having been a betrayer of the money and of his country slandered Onias as if he had terrified Heliodorus and been the worker of these evils. Because remember, when Heliodorus returned, he was done. Okay, but the reason Onias prayed for Heliodorus was so that it wouldn't become as if Jake deliberately did something to Heliodorus, which would bring upon them, unnecessary war or trouble. Verse 2, it says, "Thus was he bold to call him a traitor, that had deserved well of the city, and tendered his own nation, and was so zealous of the laws. But when their hatred went so far that by one of Simon's faction murders were committed, Onias, seeing the danger of this contention, and that Apollonius, as being the governor of Sellout and Phoenice, did rage and increase Simon's malice, he went to the king, not to be an accuser of his countrymen, but seeking the good of all, both public and private." So basically, because they had that fallout, there was a tension, there was a back and forth between the two. All right, and it was getting so bad that murders started being committed. Onias went to the king. All right, verse 6, it says, "For he saw that it was impossible that the state should continue quiet, and Simon leave his folly, unless the king did look thereunto." So things were getting out of hand. All right, so it says, "But after the death of Seleucus, and when Antiochus called Epiphanes took the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, labored underhand to be high priest." All right, labored underhand to be high priest. He wanted to exalt himself. Okay, now check this out. "Promising unto the king by intercession 300, 303 score talents of silver." Okay, which a score is 20, 3 times 20 is 60. So 360 talents of silver. And that's a lot. All right, that is a lot. They say one talent weighs, anywhere from around 80 to 90 pounds or so, which you can look that up. So imagine 360 of those worth of silver, right? It says, "And of another revenue, 80 talents. Beside this, he promised to assign 150 more, if he might have license to set him up a place for exercise, and for the training up of youth in the fashions of the heathen, and to write them of Jerusalem by the name of the Antiochians." Okay. Let's see, and I'm gonna jump down a bit just to really hit the main point, because it goes into a few other parts of it as well, the wickedness that they did. All right. Um, all right, so we're gonna jump down to right around there we go. All right. This is jump down to verse 32. So it says, "Now Menelaus," all right, so remember, you had Simon, his wicked ass, and now you have Menelaus, right? And you had Jason and all of them. So all of these people were all trying to get up, that exalt themselves, basically. Now Menelaus, as we're gonna read, all right, it says, "Now Menelaus, supposing that he had gotten a convenient time, stole certain vessels of gold out of the temple." All right, is that not what a robber would do? Okay, but he wasn't the only one. Okay, so remember, you had certain individuals that, like it says, in those times. All right, while this vision is that Daniel received is taking place, you were gonna have certain wicked Israelites. All right, referred to as robbers, sellouts. All right, which would exalt themselves, to establish that vision, but they shall fall, because we're gonna read what actually happened. What was the end? What was the end of these individuals? All right. So it says, "Stole certain vessels of gold out of the temple, and gave some of them to Andronicus, and some he sold into Tyrus and the cities round about. Which when Onias knew of a surety, he reproved him, and withdrew himself into a sanctuary at Daphne, that lieth by Antiochia. Wherefore Menelaus, taking Andronicus apart, prayed him to get Onias into his hands, who being persuaded thereunto, and coming to Onias in deceit, gave him his right hand with oaths, and though he were suspected by him, yet persuaded he him to come forth of the sanctuary. Right? So so Onias, suspected him, but and Andronicus was still able to persuade him, like, no, 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 you're good. Just come out the sanctuary, we're all good. All right. And when he did, it says, whom forthwith he shut up without regard of justice. For the which cause not only the Jews, but many also of other nations took great indignation and were much grieved for the unjust murder of the man. So because of this conspiracy between Menelaus and Andronicus, they basically put Onias, the high priest, to death. All right. And people were outraged at that. Because remember, we read in the third chapter that everything was peaceful because of his godliness and his hateful wickedness. Okay. It says, verse 35, for the which cause not only the Jews, but, oh yeah, I read that. Jump down to 36. It says, and when the king was come again from the palaces or the places about Cilicia, the Jews that were in the city and certain of the Greeks that abhorred the fact also complained because Onias was slain without cause. Therefore Antiochus was heartily sorry and moved to pity and wept because of the sober and modest behavior of him that was dead, being Onias. It says, and being kindled with anger, forthwith he took away Andronicus his purple and rent off his clothes, and leading him through the whole city. Now, purple represents that it's basically royalty, all right, or rank. Okay, which you've gone into the reason why that is that color, that purple, all right, was very, very rare to come about. That purple dye was extremely rare to come about because it was extremely difficult to make. All right, so that's why the price was super expensive, and only really those that could afford it would be able to wear that. All right, so if you were given purple, if you notice in certain accounts of the scriptures, they'll say, oh, they'll put a chain on his neck or clothe him in purple, or scarlet. All right, that's the reason it's significant. Okay, it says, and rent off his clothes and leading him through the whole city onto that very place where he had committed impiety against Onias, there slew he the accused or the cursed murderer. Thus the Lord rewarded him his punishment as he had deserved. Now, when many sacrileges had been committed in the city by Lysimachus, and this is a different Lysimachus, not the one from the four generals, all right, of Alexander. This is a different one, all right, because it's a Greek name, so others are going to use it as well. It says, by Lysimachus, with the consent of Menelaus, and the fruit thereof was spread abroad, the multitude gathered themselves together against Lysimachus, many vessels of gold being already carried away. All right, now we're gonna get to it. All right, it says, whereupon the common people rising and being filled with rage, Lysimachus armed about 3,000 men and began first to offer violence. So when he saw the people all pissed, he already got his men ready and he's already attacking. All right. He said, forget the defensive. He's going on the attack. So it says, one Aranus being the leader, a man far gone in years and no less in folly. So he was old, all right, but he wasn't wise. All right. Verse 41. They then, seeing the attempt of Lysimachus, some of them caught stones, some clubs, others handfuls of dust that was next at hand, cast them all together upon Lysimachus and those that set upon him. Thus many of them they wounded, and some they struck to the ground, and all of them they forced to flee. But check this out. But as for the church robber, okay, the robbers of thy people, remember Daniel 11 and 14, the robbers of thy people, okay? So as for the church robber himself, him they killed beside the treasury. It says, of these matters, therefore, there was an accusation laid against Menelaus, because this Menelaus, this demon, all right, was really behind the scenes of all of this, okay? It says, now when the king came to Tyrus, 3 men that were sent from the Senate pleaded the cause before him. But Menelaus, now being convicted, promised Ptolemy, the son of Darimenes, to give him much money if he would pacify the king toward him. All right. And like I said, when you see these names, the Ptolemy, Lysimachus, it's not, necessarily referring to the instant ones that we think about, right? Ptolemy, Egypt, Lysimachus, oh, the generals. It's actually, different individuals that have these names. So sometimes it can get a little confusing there. All right. But when you read the history of it, you'll understand the time periods. For example, it wouldn't make sense for this Lysimachus to be the same one who was a general of Alexander, because we're talking many years after. All right. So going back to Daniel 11, all right, and 14, it says, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. We went into that. All right. Antiochus the third. All right. You had Philip the fifth of Macedon. You even had these native Egyptians that were, going crazy over there. All right. It says, also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Okay. And this was all going on about the time that the vision was to be fulfilled. You remember, Daniel had many visions, all right, concerning different things. Okay. But in like, for example, Daniel 8, for example, that was one of the visions Daniel had. And it goes into Antiochus and what he did to us, you know. But yeah, that's pretty much where I'm gonna stop it for today. 13 and 14. Lord's will, I'll come back, next time, and we'll go from there. Because some verses, might have a lot of background information in it, so I might just do one verse. But if it's not that much, I might just lump it up with another verse. Okay. But yeah, that's pretty much it on that. As you go through the chapter, it's a lot of history. It's a lot of different names, similar names, different characters, locations, places, how they, how this person affected this person, so it definitely takes time. That's why I broke it up. All right. But Lord willing, that was edifying, all right, and informative unto the elect, those that tuned in. Um, yeah, I'm gonna just end it here. All right. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakakodash. If you want to see the previous ones, I put it together in the playlist. If you go on my channel and you go to playlist, you should see it over there, and you can see the previous ones that were on there. All right, but with that, shalom.